is identity at the center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Doing great. We got an awesome episode lined up for today with a special sponsor. We're recording and we're going to drop this episode less than a week before Gartner IAM Summit in Grapevine. Our guest is going to be there. I think this is a perfect entry point to go into Gartner IAM Summit with.
Yeah, we've got a lot of things to cover today. So let me go ahead and introduce our guest today. So just to make it clear, right, this is a sponsored episode. Our friend David Goldschlag, who is the CEO and co-founder at Aembit, is joining us today. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. It's really great to be with you.
Yeah, so let me get the website out because I've heard this name pronounced a couple different ways. So it's Aembit, and it's AEMBIT.io/IDAC. So that's a lot of letters. It will be in our show notes and it will be in the YouTube description, all that and that sort of things. So let me ask, what I'm going to assume is the source of this is it Aembit? I've also heard it pronounced as Aembit. Which is the correct way?
Okay, so it is Aembit, just like the word AMBIT would be sounded out. Okay. Of course, because of trademark and other people with websites, we added an E in. Okay. That E is meant to be skipped over. Okay. So it's still Aembit and it's Aembit.io. Adding the E in had the advantage of moving us up alphabetically. Okay. So, that's an advantage too. Okay. And, I give all the credit to my co-founder, Kevin Sapp. He's picked all the names of the companies that, we've been built together. Okay. And he's really good at it.
So this is one of those rare companies where, you see a lot of Silicon Valley where they're trying to get rid of all the vowels because all those things are taken. You guys went and added one for differentiation. I love it. That's novel and from what I've seen.
We're East Coast. What can you do? Okay.
So tell us a little bit about Aembit and tell us a little about your background. How did you get into the space of digital identity and access management? And how did that culminate into Aembit coming around?
Okay. So, Kevin and I have been doing companies together for about 20 years, all security companies, and almost all till Aembit were focused on securing user access to applications. So it's all enterprise security. And so, for instance, we did an MDM company that was supposed to be users on a mobile device getting email and other services. Okay. Then we did a ZTNA company. Okay. That was, became Netskope Private Access. The company name was New Edge Labs. That was you're on your laptop. You're trying to get to behind the firewall applications. How do you do that with something as a service instead of a VPN? But all of those were, how do you secure access from a user to an app? Okay. They were all both about identity, but about something else in addition to identity, right? The mobile or getting past the firewall, etc. Okay. When we were ready to start Aembit, we said we've been in this user space for a long time. So let's talk about non-human access, right? Software accessing other services. That's turned out to be a big deal. And we'll talk about that for the rest of the episode. Okay. But what we also said is all of these questions about firewalls and VPNs and all this were not the core problem. The core problem was identity. Okay. If you're trying to access a service on the internet, okay, this is not a network reachability problem. This is purely an identity problem. So over the course of 20 years of doing enterprise security, we landed at the core problem. And everybody knows identity is the new perimeter. Turns out it's the new perimeter for things, right, as well as people. Okay.
I'm glad you had that caveat because every time I hear identity is a new perimeter, I just kind of want to yell into the screen. No, it's not. It's been that way forever. I guess not forever, but at least for the last decade, I feel like identity has been really one of the main perimeters to defend against.
And one of the things that we have, one of the advantages we have at Aembit is everybody's familiar with that, right? They know how you log in with an IAM system. Okay. So we can take advantage of lots of analogies of how do people, employees at an enterprise, authenticate, log in. And then we say, well, what happens if it's an AI agent? What happens if it's a Python app? Okay. How do you help that log into the service? And the answer is it's the same, but different. Okay. And that's how tech is many times.
So I got to ask, does Aembit mean anything? Like, what's the story behind the name? I get the extra E in there now, but like, what does Aembit mean? Like, how did you come up with the name of the company? Or I guess, how did your co-founders come up with it?
Yeah. So Ambit means scope or boundary. Okay. And a particular use case that we're focused on is where access crosses a boundary. Okay. So let's say you have an AI agent, right, running in your enterprise that needs to do work in Salesforce. Okay. So this is no longer accessing resources within your AWS account. Rather, it's crossing a boundary and going to a third party, that's Salesforce. And the same thing applies for most accesses within the enterprise. You're going to a database. It could be your Oracle database in your network, but it could also be Snowflake or Databricks, which lives someplace else. And so this cross-boundary authentication problem is hard. Okay. And it's not solved by the cloud providers. And that's where Aembit shines.
So I find it somewhat interesting that you're working with an identity company now, but we were getting to know each other here before we hit record. And you mentioned that you worked on Tor, the onion router, a long time ago, which is probably the furthest thing possible that I can think of where you'd want to have an identity. So tell me what about your Tor background, and I guess what caused you to do the 180?
Okay. So it was wonderful. Back in the mid 90s, I was working at Naval Research Lab. I had left the National Security Agency, and I was working with two colleagues there, Paul Syverson and Michael Reed. And we had this idea, okay, right, which is, wouldn't it be good to be able to do anonymous browsing on the internet? Okay. And there's lots of stories about why the Navy funded it, okay, right, and all this, okay. But it did become really important, okay. This ability to visit something on the web, right, without somebody being able to attribute it to you using the IP addresses or whatnot were really important. And my background at NSA made it clear to me that this was important, because NSA both tries to understand the traffic of what's going on, right? What are people talking about? But more importantly, it's who's talking to whom, okay? And there's lots of data just in who's talking to whom. Call records at a phone company, if we go back to olden times, okay? We're also who was talking to whom, okay? So Tor, onion routing at the time, was trying to solve this problem of saying, let's make sure that we can communicate, but that the act of communication does not give away who's talking to whom. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't say who's talking to whom within the connection, okay? So we call this anonymous connections rather than needing to be anonymous, right, when you're doing a transaction, okay, right? So that's what we did. Okay. Now, of course, commercially, okay, you need to be able to authenticate. Okay. Right. And so in the real world, right, you may want anonymous connections, but even within that connection, you do want to authenticate, because if I'm talking to you, Jeff, or to Jim, you should be able to know that who I am. Okay. Even if it's not observable to the rest of the world. Okay. And like you said, right, this is 1995, right? So that's going on 30 years. Okay. So identity has been pretty important for a very long time. Okay.
Yeah, no kidding. And, I think it's interesting to see where Tor has evolved over time and how it's being used. Did you ever imagine that people would be using Tor the way that they are today?
So it's hard to imagine any technology that's still in play, right, 30 years later. Okay, that's pretty rare. Okay. What we did know, okay, was another colleague of ours coined this term, anonymity loves company. Okay. If only the government were using Tor, you'd know when they're searching for public source, open source intelligence about Iran, that it was the government looking for Iran. Okay. So you need all sorts of other traffic to be noise to cover that traffic. Okay. So the design of the system said we can either generate our own noise, right? Or we can leverage the rest of the world. So we opened up the system. And I think that's created, been kind of an interesting play over these years. Right.
I think interesting is a very easy way to put it. Let me get back to Aembit though. So, let me put my CISO hat on, right? And I think we've got just so many products in this space. So my question that I ask every vendor that I talk to is, what makes you guys special? Like, what is it that you think sets yourself apart from competitors in the market or contemporaries or things like that. Help me understand that and educate our audience as well.
Okay. Yeah. So like you said, there's lots of identity companies out there, major companies, right? So Okta, right, and Microsoft Entra are the IAM, dominant IAM players for human access, workforce login to services. We don't do that. Aembit does not do that. Aembit is login for software logging into services, where that software could be AI agents, okay, or other client applications trying to reach services in the enterprise, okay? So the first distinction between what we do and what other people do, okay, is we're not focused on human access. We're focused on what people are now calling non-human access, okay? And that's a big difference against the existing large players, okay? The thing that's different about us than other newer players, okay, is we aim to solve the enforcement side, the runtime side of this problem, okay? So just like Okta helps you log into a service, okay, and if Okta doesn't let you log in, you can't access the service. Aembit is the thing that lets the AI agent, or the IAM, that lets the AI agent log into Salesforce or Snowflake or whatever service it's trying to do. And without Aembit being in runtime and authorizing the connection and issuing a credential and logging it, okay, that access cannot happen. So we're critical to the infrastructure, and we're fundamental to the operation of the environment.
So David, everyone's creating AI agents now. I'm creating them, Jeff's creating them, people we work with are creating AI agents. And I guess the default mode that people tend to use is when they need to make a machine-to-machine connection, they're using their own personal credentials. I gotta imagine that's not what we want, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Okay. But we're seeing that happening in lots and lots of places, right? The obvious way to solve this problem, okay, the obvious way to make things just work, okay, because that's what people just want to do, right, is you're writing an agent, goes to Salesforce, you're going to give it your credentials, your username and password, and the agent will do it. And then that just is easy. Okay. And it's not unlike how people have been securing machine-to-machine access for a long time. You had a username and a password for a service account, right? Maybe if you were diligent, it was a different service account, right? But it was still the username and password. And the irony here is this has a bunch of cascading effects. One is you probably have to shut off MFA at Salesforce. Okay, right? Because your username and password, right, wouldn't generally be enough for a user. So you're trying to do it easy, and then you put the username and password in. Incidentally, you shared your username and password, and we've been teaching people not to share usernames and passwords. And then you shut off MFA, and all of a sudden, the bar on compliant access has been lowered. Okay, right? So you have these enterprise thresholds, right, for secure access that you've trained your employees and all of your systems to work on for 10 years. Okay. And now you're weakening those controls. Now, why is it bad to weaken those controls? Okay. Well, one is username and passwords can be stolen, right? So phishing, right? And now the bad guy can use that. And notice that would be true, Jim, even if it wasn't your username and password. Let's say it was just a username and password for that agent. Okay. That's not enough, because we know that phishing is a problem. And now the bad guy could reuse these static long-lived credentials. Okay. Another problem is attribution. If you're sharing your credentials with an agent, now when the access happens, we don't know if the agent did that access or you did that access, or you and the agent did that access together. Okay. And we should keep coming back to attribution, right, as we're talking for the next few minutes. Okay. Because attribution and audit is sort of fundamental, okay, to being able to run your enterprise responsibly. Okay. And where that brings us is in the Aembit solution. Okay. We want to make it easy to do it the right way. Because why are people taking shortcuts? Because it's easy. We just want to say, You should manage access and by managing access policies instead of managing secrets. That's what's on my shirt. Manage access, not secrets. Okay. And the idea there is replace this whole notion that you enable access by sharing a credential. Okay. Saying you enable access by setting a policy. Okay. And then you can do what IAM and Zero Trust have done for user access, which is you can move to identity-based policies. You can do strong access control. You can move away from long-lived secrets, usernames and passwords, to short-lived credentials, and you can add conditional access, all of the things that we've learned that work well when strengthening user access. Okay. So all that said, Jim, you're building these agents because they're useful. Okay. So our ultimate job is to make it easy for the developers, the people who are building these things, to do things the right way.
So it's even worse than I thought. But I grabbed a great line to use there: manage access, not secrets. And I think you did a great job of kind of laying out the base problem with what you just said there. What I'd like to know is, you got to be working with a lot of customers. I'd like to hear about what are the kind of use cases that your customers are running into on this topic.
Okay. So I think it's good to start. Let's even ignore identity. Let's just talk about things like you said, you're building agents. Okay. So for instance, we have one customer, they're a financial company. Okay. Financial services company. They have lots of analysts who are responsible for various accounts from their customers. Okay. And one of the things they need to do is the analysts need to do portfolio reviews on a periodic basis. Okay. And that portfolio review is a high-level job, okay, where the data in the portfolio is mixed with data from third-party sources and public sources and proprietary information to be able to understand the portfolio. So this company is using LLMs, right? Agents and LLMs in order to routinize some of that analysis, right? And make the analyst's job easier. And so what happens is you set up this LLM with prompts against whatever, you set up the agent with prompts against whatever LLM it's using, but it needs to access these SaaS applications that have the data or the on-network applications that have the portfolio information or other third-party proprietary information. And that login is fundamental here, right? Do you want that LLM, the agent, to be logging in as its own identity? Okay. Or should it take the shortcut, right? And log in as whoever that analyst is. And the answer is they want it to log in with some of the analyst's rights, but its own identity. Does that make sense? Right? Because the analyst has a certain rights that it's allowed to do, but that doesn't mean that you should give the analyst's identity to that agent, because that's too much rights. And then you couldn't distinguish between the agent and the analyst himself. Okay. So that's an example of a use case and the problem that they're trying to solve. And Aembit solves that problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I'd like to hear more. What are these customers' pain points? What's bothering them? What makes them pick up the phone in the first place? Probably not the phone, probably an email, or they go to your website. But what's causing them to do that in the first place, David?
Yeah. So we have another customer, a large retailer. Okay. And their motivation here was the business wants to innovate and take advantage of agentic AI. And just stepping back for a minute is really amazing, right? How much perceived and actual value, right, enterprises are seeing, right? The revenue and the use of agentic AI, right, is really very real in the enterprise. Okay. For all the complaining about hallucinations and all this, okay, these things are really very useful. Okay. So there the CISO called us, and the CISO said my enterprise wants to innovate with agentic AI. And in order to innovate, those need to access various sensitive data sources in the enterprise. We talked about Salesforce. We talked about Snowflake. You could talk about ServiceNow. Okay. And the problem is he's responsible for compliant access to those enterprise data sets. And now these agents need access. And the question is how do you provide access, okay, with a bar that's similar to the levels of access control that you had for user access. Because you don't want a personnel agent, right, to get enterprise ops data. Okay. You don't want an HR agent to get mental health information. Okay. Right. And how do you assign those rights? Okay. And you can see if things go sideways there, right, you can actually create lots of problems for yourself. Okay. But for me, and I've always liked this when we build companies, we're trying to build security companies that enable things. Okay. And here, authentication is enabling the enterprise to do in a responsible way the things that it wants to do that'll help it be more effective.
You made a statement like people in the enterprise and enterprises are building these agents. And I kind of feel like this is one of those IT trends that, even though we saw it coming, I feel like it almost caught me by surprise, where I went from not having seen agents in many organizations, client organizations, my own organization, to I'm building AI agents like 6 months later. And now this is really an identity issue. And I'm comparing that to certain other areas of identity, like decentralized identity. I feel like I've been talking about decentralized identity. We've had guests on, but I haven't had my hands on it, right? But like this AI agent thing is very real in my world. And when anything moves with that velocity, I think like the whole organization has got to be on its toes, right? Including the audit function. And I wanted to ask you about the audit function because I've got to believe that this is like becoming like in their wheelhouse overnight.
Yeah. So audit and attribution, right, are fundamental here, right? You want to be able to know what's happening, okay? Both to know, accountability and responsibility. And also when things go wrong, you got to undo it. And then things go wrong in soft ways, just operations. So audit helps you there too. But what's really interesting, Jim, is you talked about the change here, right? That's quite astounding. I think we can all look back a couple of decades. The change that's like this adoption of AI, it's akin to the change that happened with cloud, or before that was, say, the adoption of the iPhone. Okay. Do you know what I'm saying? And it's very likely that this will change businesses in even a stronger way than those previous things, because the adoption is just so beneficial, right, to the enterprise. And we all know, right? We all remember when 30 years ago, when was it in 1997, right? When the iPhone came out 2007, when the iPhone came out. People said you can't have a device without a keyboard, right? Okay. But,
how wrong they were.
How long they were, right? You also point out here, Jim, is that this development of agents is occurring, right, sort of organically within the enterprise. Okay. People are just innovating. Okay. And that's something we should encourage, right? Because you want people to help their organizations work better.
Well, I think whether you encourage it or not, it's going to happen. So why not make sure that you put the proper guardrails around it? And I think what I'm hearing from you, David, is you don't think AI is a fad and it's going to be around for a while.
No, AI is useful and we're using it, right? You probably use it in your personal life instead of Google search. Okay. Right. In the enterprise, it's accelerating the ability to do things. Coders, right? It's all moving. So, and I like the word guardrails, right? And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to give a platform, an IAM platform for agents and other pieces of software where it lets developers do less work, because authentication is hard, right? You were saying, right, Jim, let's put our usernames and passwords. So let's avoid that whole problem. Let's authentication be part of the platform so developers can focus on the parts of the code that matter, okay? And incidentally, it happens for compliant with company access policies.
So we've been kind of talking about AI and agents specifically, almost like it's a generic term, an agent. But there are multiple types of agents that are out there, right? So can you explain, maybe like what are some of the different types of agents and why is it important? I don't know, maybe is it important to have different guardrails for different types of agents? Or maybe it's the same or similar guardrails. Talk to me about that.
So all agents are pieces of software, okay? And you might give that column an application or call them a workload, right? And in this sense, they're a client workload, right? They're the thing that's accessing something else. We're seeing three kinds of agents in the enterprise, okay? We're seeing the use case I described to the financial analyst. Those agents are what we call hybrid agents. The user works with an agent to do some task. Okay. We also see autonomous agents, right? Where the agent is doing something on its own that a user or somebody else, some other machine may have done. Okay. And those two are different scenarios, right? Because the autonomous agent, the agent needs an identity. Okay. And it needs access rights, and you need to be able to attribute any action that it does, whether it's data access or tool set access or changing something in the infrastructure, okay, to that agent. The hybrid agents need that sort of blended identity that we talked about, okay? The effective rights for that agent is some combination of what the agent's entitled to do and what the controlling user is entitled to do. And we should work through some examples there, okay? But even when you do that sort of entitlement, you need to know when it was the agent operating and when the user was operating. And when the agent operates, you need to know it's operating on behalf of that user. Now, there's another use case, Jeff, where it's agent to agent, kind of chained agents, okay? And that one is sort of an expansion of that hybrid agent, right? Because instead of the agent being called by a user, the agent's called by an agent, which may be autonomous or may itself be a hybrid agent, okay? And in all of those cases, the attribution for upstream context is really very important.
So wouldn't it just be simpler to just say, okay, well, I've got an identity for an agent and an identity for a human, rather than try to do like an inference of, well, this agent has some subset of me as the assignable, actionable person for that agent, whatever that looks like, right? I'm accountable for it does. Why not just have two different identities? Or maybe that's what you're talking about. I'm just trying to understand, why would we make a differentiation there?
So we believe entirely, Jeff, that every entity should have its own unique identity. Okay. So a human who's using an agent, the agent should have an auditable identity. The human should have the auditable identity, and the transaction that happened should be attributable to both of them. Okay. Where the agent did the work on behalf of the human. Okay. But the real question is what's the rights the agent has, right? It's not the identity. It's the access rights that it has. So take an example. Let's say an HR person is using an agent to get HR information from ServiceNow. Okay. That agent should have permission to the HR information in ServiceNow. Okay. And an IT person accessing ServiceNow through that agent should have permission to the IT asset information. And so you see it's this blending, right, where it's the rights of what the ServiceNow agent can do. Maybe it's only allowed to read the data, okay, right? And then the data set in this case, right, depends upon what user it is, okay? And so it's not that the identities are sort of combined, it's that their access rights, right, are combined.
I mean, what you described there almost sounds a little bit like a privileged access management use case, where you've got this agent that is going and accessing, a certain resource, whether it's, direct on behalf of a delegate or some sort of inference of whatever. I mean, it seems to me like, is the right way to have each person has their own agentic version of themselves? Or is it, I have a shared, maybe it is an HR agent that a bunch of HR people share, and based on whoever's invoking that agent at that runtime, it's saying, okay, well, because Jeff invoked it, whatever Jeff has access to, I now have access to for this time limit. Or if I'm in IT, I have a different scope of permissions or whatever it may be.
Right. So I think what's quite beautiful about everything we're talking about are the analogies. Okay, right? So people should be able to draw on the concepts of IAM or PAM, right, in order to start to talk about what this should look like. Okay, right? And it does start to smell, right, like fine-grained control, right, that you would want to do in PAM. But the difference is, okay, is whether you have an agent for a particular person or agent that's shared among people, okay, the user may get the effective rights, okay, of that agent may be not only the on behalf rights of the user. Okay. Let's take a very trivial toy example. Okay. In that ServiceNow use case, if the agent operated on behalf of the user, then the agent could read the user's calendar. Okay. That's not what you want, right? The agent is a ServiceNow agent. You're smiling, but that's sort of a toy example. So the on behalf of relationship is not sufficient, right? Because you don't want the agent to do everything that user could do. Okay. Right. The agent should do what that user could do within the scope of what the agent is allowed to do. Okay. And we call this notion sort of a blended identity. Okay. Right. Where what you're doing is you're blending the access rights that are entitled to the user and the agent in order to figure out what the effective rights of the agent are.
I think there's a few people listening who would love to have an agent read and respond to all their email for them. Maybe they're brave right now to do that, right? I think eventually, we get to that spot.
But it's probably a different agent than the ServiceNow agent, right?
You would certainly hope so.
That's right. Right. And we'd all like that. Okay. Right. But I think again, it's the agents will have a task, right? And then the task that it's doing will get rights based on the user that's invoking it.
So let me ask you a future looking question. I think we're all familiar with like birthright provisioning, right? Things like that. And I kind of joked about an agentic version of myself. How long do you think it is that it would be where, as a standard birthright role or birthright provisioning, not only am I getting my account, I'm getting an agentic version of myself? Is this a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year out that you think you'll start to see agentic Jeff being provisioned at the same time as real Jeff?
So I think that it'll be more the tooling, the tooling that we talked about, that there'll be things out there, right, that will do specific tasks, okay, more than somebody that'll operate, sort of as my clone, okay. There's lots of ways, right, that I think you want probably a little bit shorter leash, okay, right, than the agent being able to do everything on your own. On the other hand, we all said, right, this is moving very, very fast. Okay, right. And the fact that we can entertain questions like that shows just how close, right, it's actually possible. Okay, right. So, yeah, we some friends of ours were talking, will agents sort of be your persona, right? Do you know what I'm saying? Right. I'm not sure how I get the experience, right, from the agent being my persona, but that's treading on philosophy and science fiction. So.
I loved a lot of the questions that Jeff asked. Like, I kept thinking in my mind about, if you had a humanoid robot, would you want him or her or it to be able to do anything that you can do? The answer might be yes. I don't know. I'm got to give that one some thought. But David, what I really liked about Jeff's questions is that you kind of started to help me understand a little bit more about how Aembit works. And the question I have for you is, like, who uses Aembit? Is it me and Jeff as agent developers? Is the IAM group, like the identity practitioner, the administrator of the system, is that who uses Aembit? Both of us? How's that work?
Okay. Yeah. So generally we have two stakeholders in the enterprise. We have the security function, okay, whose job it is to make sure that resources in the enterprise, whether they're data or systems or tools, are only accessed by authorized users or agents, okay? And then there's the developers who build those agents, okay? And for them, our job is to make being compliant with policies and make access, okay, authentication, authorization easy. Okay. And we have an aspect of our stuff, which is no code. Okay. So people can include our stuff in the agent and they don't have to modify their code. And what would have been the steps of authenticate the agent, in the hybrid case, authenticate the user, then check an access policy and then issue a credential and use that credential, that all gets taken care of, okay, by our stuff without the a developer needing to write any code. And then of course everything is logged, both successful attempts and not and denied attempts. Okay. So the two stakeholders.
David, I heard you say in one of our conversations, I wrote it down, identity helps folks on the front end. And now that I've got you here for the interview, I wanted to ask you what you meant by that.
Okay. Yeah. So there's two places where there's three places where identity happens. Okay. There's policies, right? This agent can access ServiceNow. Okay. There's how ServiceNow enforces those policies. An identity or an access token comes in and ServiceNow knows that it can go to HR data, right? But not IT data. But then the question is on the left-hand side of the picture, how does the agent get that access token so that it can use that? Okay. And that's the part of the problem that Aembit solves. Aembit says, set a policy and we can authenticate the agent and the user and then deliver a token that that agent can use. And the interpretation of that token is left to the system you're accessing. Okay. Now, if you think about it, that's exactly what happens with Microsoft Entra or Okta, right? They're not trying to give Salesforce a fine-grained authorization mechanism. Okay. That's Salesforce's job. The job of Okta is to deliver to the user, right? The salesperson, the token that maps them to a certain set of rights. Okay. And that's what I meant by the left side of the picture, the guy doing the access, rather than the right side where the resource is.
Very cool. I think the whole AI agent wave feels a lot like the cloud platform wave. Remember, organizations started standing up Amazon Web Services accounts, and they just have development servers at first. But then you check back in a year later, and there were like 30 accounts and all kinds of production applications, and it moved so quickly. It just became a thing that made sense for the business. And we identity practitioners, we were, I think, in many cases late to react, right? We didn't get ahead of it. And we couldn't hold back the business from, taking on this great technology. Just like today, you're seeing probably in my organization, there are probably thousands of agents that have already been built. So I think that maybe not because of just the size of the wave this time, but maybe on how quickly it came on. I think it caught a lot of identity practitioners probably flat-footed. I guess, what's the advice you have for them now? If you're an organization, you got thousands of agents, how do you get your arms around this beast?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question, but I think you want to look that even if there's thousands of agents, it's relatively greenfield. Okay. Right. So let's look at three examples. Okay. Right. We've spent probably a dozen years getting control over user access, right? By introducing IAM systems and multi-factor and conditional access and a path to zero trust. Okay. Machine access, however, is still stuck in the world of secrets management. Okay, right? So most service accounts that machines log into are API keys or username passwords for those service accounts. And that's where you have, Jim, like you said, lots and lots of years and years, right, of debt, okay, to clean up. Okay. On the other hand, agents are relatively nascent. Okay. And what we're hearing from the enterprise is it's this combination of push-pull. We need to innovate, but we need to create the platforms, right, that prevent us from getting into this problem that we're in with machine access, right, where it's just credential sprawl and long-lived credentials, right, doing all the things the way you wouldn't do for users, okay, right, but you didn't because you didn't have the plumbing along the way. And so now what we're hearing for agents, it's a time to start and doing it better, okay, using modern authentication. And that's what Aembit does. We're IAM for agentic AI.
So you've made a compelling case. And now I'm thinking, okay, well, I need to do something about the identity and the access for my agents. What are some of the things that, as I put my jaded CISO hat on again, is all right, it's going to cost me money, right? So how do I make the case to the board or the CIO or whoever, right, to get the budget? How do I measure success with Aembit and then say, okay, this is what the return is looking like that? Do you have any metrics that you typically are seeing from your customers or things like that that can help me make the case as somebody who's interested in delving into this more?
Yeah. So we're seeing metrics. One is a hard metric, right? How hard is it for developers, right? How much time do they save by not having to code up all? Okay. The second metric that's also a hard metric is if you did it the way, Jim, you said, right, with usernames and passwords or dedicated usernames and accounts, we all know the overhead associated with rotating credentials and all that, right? So there's just hard cost associated with that. And then, of course, there's just compliance. Okay. Right. You can't say that I have, Snowflake available to every user through Okta. Okay. In a controlled, gated way. Okay. But my agents can get to Snowflake, right, with username password. Okay. Right. That doesn't withstand board scrutiny either. Okay. So I think it's a combination of dev work. Okay. The management of the hygiene of the environment. Okay. Now you don't manage secrets, you manage policies. And the third one is we should do this the right way. Okay. And with agents, we're finding, Jeff, you'll like this, right? Since people sort of think of agents as people, it's easy for them to imagine that the agents should have authentication characteristics like we do for people. Okay. But then you ask yourself the obvious question. Okay. Is I have MFA for people. I text a 4-digit code to my phone, right? I can't do that, okay, to an agent because even you didn't ask that we should give your agent proxy an iPhone, okay, right? So how do you do strong auth, right? Dynamic policies, ephemeral delivery, just in time delivery of ephemeral credentials, okay, for these agents like you would for people, okay.
So what does it look like to get started with this? Is this, code that I insert as a developer into my agent, workflow? Is it some sort of UI that's going out and just tell me how I get started down this journey?
Yeah. So our system is a SaaS-based policy console. Okay. So that's where you set access policies. This agent with this user can access ServiceNow in this way. Okay. And in order to make that live, then you need to be able to establish a trust relationship so that ServiceNow, we can issue credentials to ServiceNow. That would be just like you would do with Okta. And then the idea is, of course, is that then you need to integrate it into the agents. Okay. And for the most part, our deployments are code free. Okay, right. The agent is configured to use Aembit, but the developer doesn't have to do anything extra. Okay. We always recommend that people start small. Okay. You know what I'm saying? Never mandate something new across the whole organization right away. Okay. Here, you're starting on use cases. Okay. And that use case can either be app by app, right? You're choosing to secure access to Salesforce or Snowflake or ServiceNow, or it can be with the agent developers, right, who are using particular services, and then you start there. And that becomes patterns for other people to deploy. Okay.
I mean, we all know developers love to be told what to do and how to do it. So, guardrails.
So coding up auth is hard. Okay. Coding up auth well is harder. Okay. Right. And you can either, code it up yourself, right? Or you can get it for free. Okay. And,
where do you want to spend your time?
Where do you want to spend your time?
Is it building the cool app, or is it doing the things and solving problems that have already been solved elsewhere? That's the way I look at it.
And it is actually amazing, Jeff, that auth is still a application level function. Okay. Right. It's so fundamental that it should just be part of the platform. Okay. And that's what Aembit tries to do.
That's great. So we started the conversation with onions and onion routing. We went to identity for agents, and I was looking through your background as we kind of close out the conversation here today. You did work on DIVX, and I had to explain before we hit record with Jim, what DIVX was. And I think it was late 90s. And so, we've got a lot of, folks in our generation who might be familiar with it, but talk to me a little bit about DIVX itself, what it is, or what it was, I guess. I'm not even sure if it still exists. Maybe you can help me with that. And then talk to me about some of the identity components maybe that went into DIVX, because that was really one of the first, maybe Internet of things that people kind of might be familiar with at that point in juncture.
Yeah, so DIVX was really very cool business. Okay, so we're all going to date ourselves here. Okay, right? So DIVX existed when Blockbuster existed. Okay, right? And how did you rent a movie? It was a VHS tape. Okay, right? And you'd go to Blockbuster and there'd be all these movies, and the popular ones were gone, of course, right? Because they weren't available. And then you'd pick the movie that you wanted. Okay, and then you'd bring it home, and then you'd watch it, and then you'd return it probably late and pay a late fee. Okay. Right. And a lot of the revenue was from those late fees. Okay. So you made 2 trips. Okay. Paid a rental fee and a late fee. Okay. So DIVX, not the DIVX codec. Okay. That was who the name was sold to after it closed. Okay. But DIVX was when DVDs were coming out. Okay. The founders of DIVX, which was owned by Circuit City, another blast from the past. Okay. Right. So today they were competitor to Best Buy. Okay.
I feel so much white coming into all of our beards as we're talking about this.
It's like amazing. Okay. Right. And so DVDs were coming out, and the founders of DIVX said, wouldn't it be cool if we could sell you a DVD instead of for $25, whatever it would cost you, we could sell you a DVD for the price of a rental, $3. Okay. And more importantly, that DVD could be available at a retailer instead of a store that knew how to rent and process a return. Okay. Because that was complicated. So imagine you're at the checkout aisle in your grocery store and the top 20 movies are there and they cost $3 a piece, and you buy it and then you go home and you watch the movie. Okay. And then you can put it on your shelf and watch it again and be charged another $3, but you don't have to return it. Okay. No more late fees. Okay. Right. So this was really a very cool idea. And for all of the young people on the call, this is before Netflix had streaming. Okay. Right. Netflix actually had a DVD rental business by mail when they first started. Right. So that had the same plumbing problem, right? It had to work in both directions. So this is an identity problem. Okay. Right. How do you know who the renter is? How do you know what DVD player is playing it? Okay. And how do you know what disc you're playing? Okay. And that knowing which disc you're playing, I don't mean which movie you're playing, right? Remember, when you paid $3, that first play was free. So how did you know that a disc was played only the first time, and the second time you would charge for it? So what DIVX did is DVDs are all clones. Okay. Right. They're stamped. Okay. But post stamping, they would etch a serial number into the DVD that could be read by the machine. And the first time a DVD serial number showed up, that consumed the purchase price, the built-in rental price. And if you played it again a month later, okay, then you would be charged again. Okay. And so this was very interesting because you were giving at a large scale an identity to a DVD. Okay. And it flowed through the whole system. And there were the other identities that we talked about, and watermarking and all this stuff. A really cool business. Okay. They had deals with all the studios, almost all the studios. And then they shut it down. And that's a story for a conversation over a beer. Okay. So
I think we just said Circuit City for the first time ever on this podcast. 380 some episodes. And for the first time in that combination, in that sequence, Circuit City just came up. So, David, that's a blast from the past.
It's great. Okay. And it was cool to be talking and you recognizing that. That's like the coolest thing. Okay. So
I'm a nerd. What can I say? That's fine. Jim, do you remember DIVX at all? Does any of this ring a bell for you? Like, back in the days of yore?
So I do remember the DIVX codec now. One of the things I would do is take DVDs and, copy them to other DVDs. And you basically had to reverse out the DIVX codec and save it as an MP4 file, etc. So I think I just admitted to a federal crime, but
statute of limitations.
Probably
hopefully.
Nobody's going to come after me. I think the statute of limitations has gone by. I do remember one thing. My grandfather used to rent movies and record them. And then the whole family would come over and he was like the Blockbuster video, but there was no late fee and no rental fee. You could just borrow Terminator 2 and keep it for a week. Those are the good old days.
The good old days, right? And you're lucky you had a grandfather like that, okay? Because he did the work to make it free, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But for most people, if it was $3, okay, it was all right, so.
Well, the way that the industry has evolved over time, right? So we had, Blockbuster video. You'd go pick up your video. For me, it was pick up video games, Super Nintendo, whatever it may be, right? Get that stuff. And then you had things like this DVD, DIVX type approach, Netflix, when it was, mail order. And I think Redbox was around for a little while at some point as well as kind of another idea. And then it became subscription based. It was like, okay, now it's a buffet because people, I think, got sick and tired of being sort of nickeled and dimed, right? So it had like the iTunes store. It's like, okay, 99 cents for a song. And then it was, $1.99, I think, to rent a movie. And then people started wanting to own the digital media themselves. And now we're in this era of subscription, hell, so to speak, where you've got a subscription for like 8 different services and you don't actually own anything, but you have the rights to consume as much of this as you want. And I consume, quite a bit of it, just like I'm sure everyone else does. But now we're seeing those subscription prices go so crazy that now it's like people want to actually buy the thing and put it on a shelf. So now you have things, people are buying DVDs and, trying to think of other ways to archive their media so that they don't have to keep paying subscriptions and things like that.
Just think about this, Jeff. In your 20s, did you have more than or less than 100 CDs?
I had more than 100, and then I had hundreds of CDs at one point. I undertook the challenge of digitizing them all, turning them into MP3s, and I think the highest codec at that point or bit rate would have been 128, maybe 192 bits. And now you've got things like lossless and, 320 and variable bit rates. And, I had so many DVDs and CDs that were burnt that turned into trash because the buffer overflow or buffer underrun, I can't remember which one it was. It was a real mess, man.
Yeah.
But
the funny thing was, though, you felt like you owned
subscription, right?
You own that music in the
Today,
CDs, right? But ultimately now you have Apple Music or Spotify or something like that. And aren't you happier? Isn't it better? It's like, oh, you hear this new song and it's like, I want to hear that song 15 times today. You can do it.
Well, define better. I think the convenience is certainly there. I'm perfectly willing, and I have been for years at this point, to pay some certain amount of money, typically somewhere between $13 and $18 a month, right, for a media service of some sort. I feel like you get the value out of it. I'm not interested in having my background be all these different, CDs and things like that I used to have. But you've got people who are now interested in collecting vinyl. They want to go back to that old school kind of fidelity of the audio itself. And, I think there is something a little bit, romanticized about having the album, right? And the album cover and the artwork and the lyrics and all that stuff. You don't get that in the digital world. And so I can kind of see it both ways.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm going to isolate that. You just said I was right. And that's going to become
play it over and over again,
right? All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. David, thank you so much for taking time with us. Definitely want to get people out there to visit Aembit, and I'll spell it out here, aembit.io/IDAC. We'll have a link in our show notes. I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile as well for people to kind of reach out there, either to, ask questions about Aembit or maybe just reminisce about DIVX or, whatever it may be. And we'll leave it there for this week. We are on the web, idacpodcast.com. Thank you, David, again for sponsoring this episode. And do all the things like and subscribe, share with all your friends, and let people know the gospel of I am. So thanks, everybody, for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with y'all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.